I had been on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson for 9 years. Nobody at NBC, nobody, not one person, after 9 years of going on Carson 3 and 4 times a year and killing, nobody said, why don't we talk to this kid?
There are no new shows, coming up on television unless we get the strike settled. In fact, if it were not for the presidential debates, there'd be no television comedy at all.
For 30 years, if you wanted to make it in comedy, one man could make or break you, Johnny Carson. The Tonight Show wasn't just a late-night program. It was the ultimate launchpad, and Carson's couch was the golden ticket every comedian dreamed of sitting on. He celebrated rebels like George Carlin, wild cards like Robin Williams, and deadpan geniuses like Norm Macdonald. But the biggest comic of the 1990s, Jerry Seinfeld, never got that nod. Behind the scenes, sources say Carson didn't just dislike Seinfeld's act, he actively disliked the man. What really drove Carson to despise him? And did they ever smooth things over before Johnny passed away? Stick around, because the real story is stranger than you think.
Right now, he's a very funny young man who's off to a very good start as a stand-up comedian, and he'll be opening for Andy Williams December 8th to the 13th at the Carlton in Bloomington, Minnesota. Would you welcome Jerry Seinfeld?
All right. Hey, how's everybody doing? Well, good. I've been doing pretty good. I've been working a lot and making some money. Bank noticed I was making some money. They said, hey, let's give this kid some credit cards, see if he can hold on to it.
To really get why there was a bit of frost between Johnny Carson and Jerry Seinfeld, you first have to understand just how much power Johnny actually had. From the early 1960s until the early 1990s, The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, wasn't just another late-night program. It was the cultural mountaintop. If you were a young comic and you wanted to make it big, the fastest way was to land 5 good minutes in front of Carson. People in the business even had a name for it, the Carson Springboard. If Johnny laughed, really laughed, in that slow, genuine way of his, your phone would be ringing the next morning with club offers, agents, and sometimes sitcom deals. That was the level of influence he carried. Think about how many comedy giants passed through his stage. David Letterman got his big push there. Jay Leno, same thing. Ellen DeGeneres was practically introduced to the world by Johnny. Even Gary Shandling's career trajectory owes a huge debt to that one late-night stamp of approval. For most comics, making Carson smile wasn't just validation, it was the ultimate career-changing moment. Jerry Seinfeld had that opportunity in May of 1981. He was still in his 20s, sharp suit, clean material, and his routine was already in that everyday observation style we all associate with him now. The set went well, so well that he got invited back, which was a big deal. But here's where the story takes a turn. Even though the performances worked, people behind the scenes noticed something a little off in the chemistry between Carson and Seinfeld. Johnny came from the Depression-era Midwest, a world where humility and gratitude weren't just polite gestures, they were values he measured people by. After a successful spot, most comics would hang around backstage, shaking hands, thanking producers, maybe even scribbling out a thank you note to Johnny himself. It was almost an unspoken rule, a way to show you understood what kind of stage you'd just been given. Skipping that step wasn't just a faux pas, it was practically a red flag. Seinfeld, on the other hand, was wired differently. He was hyper-focused on his craft to the point where everything else faded into the background. For him, the work itself was the thank you. Get on stage, deliver a flawless set, and that should speak for itself. But to the crew, and eventually to Carson, that came across as standoffish. Instead of soaking up the moment or chatting with stagehands, Jerry was known to do his set and then quietly slip out. Some described it as an invisible wall, like he wasn't really interested in anything outside of the jokes themselves. Johnny, meanwhile, prided himself on knowing his staff's names, asking about their families, and creating that sense of connection in the room. When he looked at Seinfeld, he saw the skill, no question about that, but he also sensed a missing ingredient, what he called the heat, that human touch that made an audience feel like you were letting them in on something personal. And that's where their worlds really started to clash.
That's funny stuff.
Thank you.
That's very funny
I
stuff.
feel funny tonight.
Yeah, what? Do you? You ever
Yeah.
have those days where you don't feel funny?
Yeah.
You get up and nothing's cooking?
And then somehow you get out there and the audience makes you feel silly for some reason.
Yeah.
They laugh and you go, yeah, that is funny.
Yeah. You got any other funny people in your family? Brothers, sisters?
I have a sister.
Yeah.
I think she's that funny.
Yeah.
She got married.
That's nice.
Yeah, that was real nice. I was shocked always, I think, to the sibling. I was upset, I think. Well, you know, when a brother or sister gets married, the way you know them, you can't believe anyone would marry them.
When you look at Johnny Carson and Jerry Seinfeld side by side, it almost feels like they were speaking two totally different comedy languages. Carson had always believed that the best laughs came from letting the audience see a little bit of your soul, even the messy parts. He gravitated toward comics who laid themselves bare, like Richard Pryor, who somehow managed to take the darkest parts of his life and spin them into comedy that felt both hilarious and brutally honest, or Joan Rivers, who didn't care if her honesty made people uncomfortable because that was the point, or even Robin Williams, whose frantic, larger-than-life energy always hinted at something fragile underneath. For Carson, comedy wasn't just a distraction from life. It was a way to connect with people on a deeper level, to make them feel something in addition to laughing. Seinfeld's way of thinking couldn't have been more different. He built his whole career on the idea that comedy didn't need to dig into pain or politics or personal trauma. It could just be about the little ordinary details of everyday life. Airplane food, mismatched socks, why people double dip at parties. Those were his sweet spots. And to his credit, he did it better than almost anyone, turning what some might see as trivial into sharp, universally relatable material. But here's the thing. While audiences love that show about nothing approach, Carson never fully bought in. He respected Jerry's craftsmanship and his precision, sure, but he saw the comedy as a little too polished, too safe, almost like it skimmed the surface of life without ever really diving into the depths where the real treasures are. And when Seinfeld's fame exploded in the 90s, those differences started to feel less like harmless preferences and more like a collision waiting to happen. Jerry would go on record in interviews, shrugging off the late-night talk show format, the very format that had launched him into the spotlight, as the shallow end of the pool. He even bragged that part of his sitcom's appeal was that it never tried to hug the audience, meaning it didn't get sentimental or emotional. Now, imagine how that sounded to Johnny, who had spent 3 decades perfecting the art of the talk show, balancing wit, timing, and genuine connection night after night. To him, Seinfeld wasn't just saying he preferred a different kind of comedy, he was basically dismissing the whole foundation of what Carson and others had built.
I had been on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson for 9 years. Nobody at NBC, nobody, not one person, after 9 years of going on Carson 3 and 4 times a year and killing, nobody said...
9 years of killing on the Carson show should have triggered something in them.
Something, nothing.
Nothing.
So he sends this letter. I come in for the meeting. They go, do you have anything you would like to do if you ever did a show for us? I said, not really.
Writers who work close to Johnny remember how annoyed he was, not just at Seinfeld's comments, but at the attitude behind them. To Carson, it felt like Jerry was waving off the very stage that had given him his shot. And Carson wasn't the type to forget that sort of thing. If Jerry's socks jokes were funny, fine. But Johnny believed standing out there for 40 minutes every single night without a safety net was a different beast altogether, and he thought Jerry didn't give that tradition the respect it deserved. And this wasn't just about comedy styles, it cut into Carson's sense of values too. Because as Seinfeld's career and wealth grew, there were other things in the 90s that rubbed Johnny the wrong way. Things that went beyond punchlines and straight into personal choices. The first sore spot was money. Johnny came from small-town Nebraska, growing up during the Depression, and even when he became one of the richest entertainers on television, he never rubbed it in people's faces. His style was to keep things quiet. He lived well, sure, but he wasn't out there doing photo spreads about his fortune. He always believed that showing off your wealth was not only tacky, but also made you lose touch with the regular audience that had built you up in the first place. For Johnny, money was just something that gave you freedom, not something you made into your personality. Jerry, on the other hand, became ridiculously wealthy once Seinfeld hit syndication in the mid-90s. We're talking hundreds of millions rolling in, and he leaned into it in a way that really made headlines. His love of cars, especially Porsches, turned into a kind of second career. He built this massive custom garage in Manhattan just to house them, and pretty soon it wasn't just a hobby, it was part of his public image. And while a lot of fans saw it as quirky or cool, Carson saw it as unnecessary bragging. There was even a story floating around about Jerry joking that late-night television money was cute, but syndication money was real money. To Johnny, who had spent 30 straight years grinding out shows 5 nights a week and who saw The Tonight Show as sacred ground, that was like spitting on the very platform that had helped Jerry get where he was. People close to Johnny say he was genuinely irritated when he saw glossy magazine spreads of Jerry's garage collection, muttering that the kid cared more about cars than about character. But it wasn't just about cars or money. What really sealed the deal was Jerry's personal life, making tabloid waves in the early 90s. In 1993, when Jerry was 39, he started dating Shoshana Lonstein, who at the time was only 17 and still in high school. Legally, in New York, it wasn't against the law, but let's be honest, the optics were terrible. You had one of the most famous comedians in America, already a household name, dating someone who was barely out of her teens, and of course, the tabloids had a field day. Jerry defended the relationship publicly, saying she was smart and mature, but Carson looked at it completely differently. For him, public figures had a responsibility when scandals started circling. You were supposed to pull back, lay low, and avoid dragging your name and your work through the mud. Jerry, instead, did the opposite. He took her to premieres, sat courtside with her at basketball games, and posed for photos like it was no big deal. That rubbed Johnny the wrong way in a huge way. He wasn't perfect himself. He had his own messy divorces and relationships, but there were lines you didn't cross in public if you wanted to keep respect. And from Carson's perspective, Jerry crossed them without hesitation. People who worked on The Tonight Show at the time said Johnny actually told his team not to book Seinfeld for a stretch of over a year, which in the world of late-night comedy is basically a silent blacklist. For a comic, being away from that stage for that long was career damage, and Carson knew it. Now here's where things get even more interesting. Johnny Carson's dislike for Jerry Seinfeld wasn't just about money or tabloid headlines. It became even clearer when you compared how he treated Seinfeld versus how he treated another comic who couldn't have been more different, Norm Macdonald. Norm was kind of the anti-Seinfeld in every possible way. He didn't walk out on stage polished and perfect. Instead, he usually looked like he'd just rolled out of bed in a wrinkled suit, and his delivery was slow, halting, and often so dry that some people didn't even realize he was joking until a beat later. But that was exactly what Carson loved. To him, Norm represented that older, soulful tradition of comedy. The kind that wasn't about showing off, but about connecting with people through timing, humility, and respect for the craft. And respect was a big deal for Carson. Norm always treated his late-night appearances like they mattered. He'd hang out backstage, chat with the crew, and never acted like he was too big for the room. Staff members remembered Carson flat out saying, "McDonald gets it. Comedy's about humility. That other guy thinks he's above the room." And you don't need 3 guesses to know who that other guy was. What's kind of sad is that Norm never actually got his chance to sit down with Carson on The Tonight Show before Johnny retired. Someone in the booking office had written him off as more of a Jay comic than a Johnny comic, meaning he supposedly fit better with Jay Leno's style than with Carson's. That decision ended up haunting Norm, who looked up to Carson his entire life. But years later, after Carson had stepped away from TV, he caught Norm's Larry King impression on Saturday Night Live and apparently loved it so much that he personally reached out. Carson actually invited Norm to his private office, where the two finally got to meet and bond. That says a lot about where Johnny's heart really was. But Seinfeld? Totally different story. Even though Carson had retired in 1992, his opinion still mattered a ton in the comedy world, and the chill between him and Jerry didn't thaw. One of the most talked about moments came at a Friars Club event in 1995. Actor and comedian Kevin Pollak was there and said it was like watching a glacier completely ignore a speedboat. Carson just walked right past Seinfeld as if he wasn't even there. Jerry tried to break the ice. He complimented Carson's cufflinks, but Carson supposedly glanced down, looked back up at him, and hit him with a line that instantly froze the whole room. "They're vintage, like your date." And then he just walked away. Ouch. That moment got passed around comedy circles for years. Now, people who knew Carson will tell you he could be distant and even cold when the cameras weren't rolling. But this wasn't just his usual privacy kicking in. This was different. This was targeted. To the folks inside the industry, it was clear. Carson was done with Jerry, and he wasn't afraid to show it. And really, it all came down to what Johnny valued most: professional etiquette, respect for the institutions of comedy, and humility. In his mind, Seinfeld had crossed all the lines, dismissing the talk show format, flaunting his wealth, stepping into controversial relationships, and carrying himself with an arrogance that Carson couldn't stand. Jerry Seinfeld has never publicly criticized Johnny Carson, and if you follow his interviews or read about his career, he consistently calls Carson a master and the holy grail of comedy. From Seinfeld's perspective, there was never any drama. He says he was never aware of tension between them. Friends who know him well insist it wasn't arrogance that made him seem distant. It was a singular, almost obsessive focus on his craft. Seinfeld's world revolves around writing, refining, and performing jokes, and he protects his private life fiercely, treating the quality of the performance as the ultimate form of gratitude. To someone like Carson, who came from a time when show business was built on community, etiquette, and a kind of old-school reverence, thank you notes, handshakes, making everyone feel part of the process, that mindset could feel cold, even disrespectful. A Tonight Show veteran once summed it up perfectly. Johnny wanted bowing. Jerry wanted to be quiet so he could write more jokes. But in the end, Carson's cold shoulder never slowed Seinfeld down. If anything, it barely registered in the grand story of his career. Seinfeld became a cultural phenomenon, a 4-camera sitcom that turned into a massive syndication machine, generating hundreds of millions over the years. Carson's disapproval didn't leave a dent. It just became a behind-the-scenes anecdote, a footnote in the rise of one of television's most influential comedians. Some insiders even suggest that knowing Carson's approval would never come fueled Seinfeld's obsessive drive for perfection, pushing him to make every joke, every scene, as flawless as possible. When Johnny Carson passed away in 2005, Seinfeld sent a quiet, thoughtful gesture, flowers and a short note that reportedly read simply, "Thank you for the stage." It was brief, understated, and very much in line with Seinfeld's style, respectful, but without any fanfare. Even after Carson's death, though, the divide lingered. A publicist from Carson's camp told the New York Times that the host took Seinfeld's perceived attachment to the grave, cementing a story that had become almost legendary in comedy circles. Looking back, the coldness between them wasn't just personal. It reflected a bigger shift in the entertainment world. Carson represented a centralized Hollywood hierarchy, a gatekeeper whose blessing could make or break careers. Seinfeld represented a new era, one where talent could build its own empire, independent of the old guard's approval. Their standoff wasn't petty, it was generational, philosophical, and symbolic. One man demanded humility, tradition, and shared reverence. The other was busy crafting the next punchline, writing his own rules, and redefining what it meant to be a comedian in the modern era. Neither ever bent, and in that stubborn space between them, the legend of Carson versus Seinfeld was born. Did this change your perception of these two comedy legends? Let us know in the comments below. Was Carson rightfully guarding a sacred tradition, or was he an old king bitter about the new prince who refused to kiss the ring? Hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden feuds of Hollywood history.